Okay, we now find ourselves at the final talk for today's portion of our conference. Our next speaker is Dr. Keith Raymond Harris, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Vienna, affiliated, if I'm not mistaken, with the Knowledge in Crisis Project.
Exactly.
The title of the talk has been cut off a little bit. It is The Threat of Misinformation and What the Threats, rather, plural, of misinformation and what not to do about them. So, floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Thanks very much to the organizers and everyone for sticking around. I hope you're not too tired yet. I just want to say at the top, my mic technique is famously terrible. So if at any point I'm like this and you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll correct. Okay, so basically the talk is about the nature of misinformation, what sort of problems it causes for the acquisition of knowledge. So this is very much an epistemology talk. And then later in the talk, I'll talk about one particular type of response to the threat of misinformation, and that is the use of content moderation to address these threats to knowledge. And I'll argue that a certain approach to content moderation is perhaps undesirable in certain respects, but maybe there's a preferable way of doing things. Okay, so first of all, just talking about concepts here. So the way I tend to think about misinformation in general is as a sort of set of counterparts to more legitimate forms of information. So the idea, right, is that for each category of misinformation, there is another category of things which confers sort of genuine, accurate information. So fake news, obviously, is the fake counterpart of sort of legitimate, accurate, reliable news. Deep fakes are the counterpart of sort of genuine video footage. Doctored photographs, counterpart of genuine photographs. Fraudulent science, the counterpart of, obviously, legitimate science. So the basic idea is that there are certain forms of information that are produced by a reliable process, and that's why we put stock in them. And then there are these other things that sort of mimic those forms of information, and so therefore we might be tricked by them, at least in the short term. It doesn't matter much for the purposes of this talk, but then I think of disinformation as being sort of intentionally manipulative misinformation. So I'm going to focus on, at least in the first part of the talk, about the threat of misinformation to knowledge acquisition. And so importantly, I'll just sort of provide a kind of definition of what knowledge is, how I'm understanding it here, to explain this better. So this will be familiar to basically anyone who studies philosophy. I'm going to understand knowledge as having three components: truth, belief, and warrant. Any epistemologist will immediately recognize that invoking warrant here is just sort of sweeping under the rug a bunch of issues about what specifically warrant is. But that's kind of intentional, right? So I think there are all these different factors that people take to be relevant to warrant. They all have some epistemological role. I don't care that much about precisely how you define knowledge, but there are various things worth mentioning here. So you might understand warrant, for example, partially in terms of reliability of belief-forming processes, maybe in terms of the amount of evidential support you have for a proposition, maybe whether there are a lack of uneliminated relevant alternatives, maybe in terms of some modal condition like safety, maybe even sensitivity. Right. So the idea is that because knowledge has these different components, you can threaten knowledge by threatening any one of those components. They're all necessary for knowledge. So there are different pathways by which knowledge might be threatened. And the idea is that misinformation then can pose various different threats to knowledge. So the first threat I talk about as being the deceptive threat of misinformation. The idea here being that misinformation poses a deceptive threat to the extent that it threatens to cause false beliefs as opposed to true ones. So this is I think the most obvious sort of concern people have about misinformation. They see it and they form a false belief, and then maybe they even act on that belief. So this deceptive threat then depends on at least two things. It depends on people actually being exposed to misinformation and actually taking it for being real. So in order to be deceived, you have to sort of encounter the thing, and you have to take it to be real, and therefore form a false belief based on it. There's sort of a big scholarly debate about the extent to which people really are deceived by misinformation. But there are clearly cases where this does happen. So as Anna already mentioned, this is Edgar Madison Wells. This is the guy who actually drove to the pizza place to investigate whether there were children being held as sex slaves in the basement of the pizza place. This guy clearly believed in Pizzagate. There's no question about it. If you look at the criminal complaint against him, I think this is actually kind of a heartbreaking story because as he was driving there, he was recording messages for his children about how, like, look, I taught you that when people are in danger, you need to protect them. This is the right thing to do. So he clearly thought that there were children being sort of tortured, and he acted on this. Very stupid thing to do in light of the fact that the information was nonsense, but it's a sensible thing to do if you actually believe that. On the other hand, most people who kind of profess to believe in things like Pizzagate or QAnon more broadly, they don't act in that extreme way on it. And that sort of fact has led some people to think, well, maybe people don't really believe this stuff. They're just sort of saying that they believe it as a way of expressing that they don't like the Democrats. You know, it's a way of saying you don't like Hillary Clinton, for example. I mean, my own view is somewhere in the middle, right? So not many people act in the super drastic way, but a lot of people have messed up their lives by believing in or claiming to believe in QAnon and so on. So many kind of families have been torn apart by these weird beliefs. There are a lot of people who have lost like credibility among their friends and family for believing in this stuff. I was telling people before, I had a hairdresser that I would not go to anymore because they immediately started talking about QAnon when I went to get my haircut. So there are actual worldly costs that people incur for professing these sort of beliefs. It's not merely a expressive thing, I don't think. So anyway, but there are, I mean, questions about the extent to which people believe these falsehoods. So scholars have noted, for example, that in sort of quantitative studies that basically it's a fairly small group of people who's responsible for most of the consumption and sharing of misinformation. It's not so much that there are many, many people who are kind of falling down the rabbit hole, but rather there's a relatively small number of people who consume a lot of it and they have a high demand for it and they like actively seek it out and so on. That's at least what some of the information seems to show. And then when it comes to things like Pizzagate and QAnon and so on, some scholars have noted that the way a lot of people act on this information is by, for example, leaving negative reviews of pizza places, which seems like a ridiculous thing to do if you actually believe the content of those claims, right? Again, another complication. Seems like sometimes when people claim to believe in these things, they're just sort of signaling their own political loyalties as opposed to stating their genuine beliefs. So this is all just to say that you shouldn't sort of take at face value X number of people say that they believe in QAnon, so therefore X number of people actually believe in it. Things are a bit more nuanced, but I think still plenty of people believe in these weird things. So lastly, this deceptive threat, however bad it is now, you might think it's going to get worse in the future. So especially as Gen AI continues to improve, that might lead to there being more convincing deepfakes, more convincing fake videos and photos and so on, as well as more effective ways of disseminating these things through bots that can seem to have sort of natural conversations with you and then suddenly hit you with some misinformation and so on. So that's the deceptive threat. The skeptical threat is the threat basically to believe. So one kind of secondary problem with misinformation is once you're aware that there's misinformation out there, you might think, oh, well, I don't want to be tricked, so therefore I'm not going to believe this thing that I read online, but maybe the thing you read online is actually correct, and you should be believing it, right? That's basically the skeptical threat. Now, one interesting thing about the skeptical threat is, in contrast to the deceptive threat, doesn't really depend on actually being exposed to misinformation. It just depends on you thinking that there's misinformation out there. So when there are, for example, news stories about how much misinformation there is, that might lead you to sort of succumb to the skeptical threat, even though you yourself haven't encountered much straight up misinformation. Interestingly, I mean, there are these attempts like to basically instill something like an inoculation against misinformation. One concern about those is precisely that they cause the skeptical threat. So there are these early studies like trying to basically warn against the threat of misinformation or expose people to a little bit of it so that they become more wary of information in the future. And it kind of works, but it doesn't just work for false information, it also works for true information. So in other words, inoculation attempts also cause a sort of skeptical threat. Now, one type of misinformation that poses an especially sort of potent skeptical threat is conspiracy theories. They do this in two ways. So on the one hand, you might think of conspiracy theories as being sort of fake explanations that are alternatives to the actual explanation. And so they work by making people question the actual explanation in favor of maybe thinking that there's some credence for the fake explanation. That's a kind of narrow way in which they might cause a skeptical threat. The broader way, and ultimately the more concerning way, I think, is that conspiracy theories tend to call into doubt the reliability of certain forms of information. So, for example, if you believe in flat Earth, in order to sustain that belief, you have to also believe that like NASA is lying to you, all the space agencies are lying to you. And once you believe that, then there's all sorts of other things that you're going to be less inclined to believe, including things like climate change and so on. Now, the last sort of threat, I think, is like the least practically significant, but the most actually interesting for epistemologists. This is what I call the epistemic threat. And this is just the sense in which misinformation threatens the warrant condition on knowledge. And the way in which it does this will depend on how you construe a warrant, right? So different epistemologists would approach this somewhat differently. I mean, one possibility is that misinformation reduces the evidential value of real information. So Don Fallis has this nice analogy with sort of mimic species in nature. So for example, snakes that are not themselves venomous but look like venomous snakes. The idea is that what these do is that they reduce the evidential value of the patterning of the genuinely venomous snake. And similarly, a deepfake reduces the evidential value of real video footage. Another possibility is that fakes are kind of like what epistemologists are familiar with, like fake barns in the environment. There are features of the environment that make it just a matter of luck that you form a true belief as opposed to a false one. Alternatively, you might think misinformation introduces relevant alternatives to your beliefs. So it could always be, you read some news story, it's a relevant alternative, maybe that it was just a fake story, or you see a real video, it's a relevant alternative, it could have been faked very easily. So misinformation and sort of techniques for generating it can introduce relevant alternatives, is the idea. And very, very similarly, misinformation might reduce the reliability of certain belief-forming processes. So you might have thought like, okay, 30 years ago, forming beliefs based on really lifelike video, that was a pretty reliable belief-forming method. The concern is, as there's more deep fakes, that becomes a bit less reliable. Okay, sorry, my phone is like freaking out, so I'm trying to keep track of time here. Okay, so I think the question of when misinformation threatens warrant is somewhat more interesting than the question of when it threatens truth or belief. And the idea is that it's not on the face of things super clear, like when the warrant condition is threatened. So what has to be the case about misinformation in order for there to be a threat to warrant? So one possibility is that it's like the real existence of misinformation in the environment that threatens warrant. Another possibility is that it's just the ability to generate misinformation that threatens warrant. So the difference here would be, right, you might say, okay, what matters as to whether you can form a warranted belief based on some video footage is whether there are actually a bunch of similar deepfakes out there. Or you might say, no, what matters is that someone easily could have created the same video, even if they didn't in fact do it. That's what threatens warrant. That would be the ability view. My own kind of preference is for something like the propensity view, which is that it's a matter not just of ability, but also motivation and technology. So generally, if you see a video of some super mundane thing, that doesn't seem like that's really threatened by possibility of misinformation, even though somebody could create a fake, because nobody would bother to create a super mundane video. But if you see a video of some politician uttering a slur, and that's your only evidence that the politician uttered a slur, maybe you have more reason for concern in that case, because somebody would have the motivation to kind of slander that politician, right? So which view is right? This was suggested to me by Alessandro Tonazzini. I think it's exactly right. It depends on what you think warrant involves. So maybe something like the existence view might be right for a basic reliabilist view. Something like the propensity view might be right if you think that there's a modal condition on knowledge, for example. Okay, so those are just laying out the basic threats of misinformation. Personally, I think that there are some limits on these threats, and that the threats are sometimes overblown a little bit. So it's not as if people sort of see some information in their environment and they immediately believe that it's correct or something like that. No, you compare it against your background knowledge. Does it seem plausible in light of what you already know, and so on. So things like your background knowledge can make a big difference to whether or not you're susceptible to believing misinformation. And maybe can also safeguard and make you willing to believe things that really are true. Similarly, your discriminatory abilities, that is your ability to distinguish between misinformation and actual information, that can also make a difference. So think of the people who, are not at all familiar with deep fakes and the kind of defects that they typically have. They might be more prone to deception than someone who's very familiar with, the fact that deep fakes struggle with fingers and so on, right? That's some of the types of information that might help, or abilities that might help. But also, I think a big factor is just sort of the social context in which you encounter information. So part of what determines whether or not you're going to believe something is, what was the source? Did it come from someone who's generally reliable, or did it come from someone who's often like a liar or a bullshitter? I think also not just the source, but the channel. So a particular Twitter account or a particular news station might be more reputable than another. And you might also think in terms of, like, how often has it been, in the social media context, how often has it been shared or liked? If you see a video that seems super important, but it's only been shared by 3 people and liked by 5, that's a bit suspicious. Whereas if it clears some threshold of getting a lot of attention, you might think that's more credible, right? Now there's a difficulty here, especially on this last point, which is that there can be causes that make it the case that there is a lot of sort of misleading social evidence of that sort. So, as has been discussed already, people might share misinformation not because they really believe it's true or credible, but because it's a way of signaling their political identity. Additionally, as C.T. Wen has talked about, maybe people share things not even as a way of signaling political identity, but just as a way of sort of participating in the gamification of social media. So if you share a really ridiculous story, you might get a lot of attention, you get a lot of likes, a lot of retweets, and so on. So these factors can kind of inflate the amount of social evidence you have favoring the reliability of something. That might make things a bit confusing. It's cut off on the slides, but one other factor I mentioned here is sort of the possibility of what I call higher order misinformation. So there are a lot of there's a lot of kind of statistics that sort of credulously say things like 45% of Republicans believe that the 2020 election was stolen. Now, I think a lot of what's going on in those cases is something like expressive responding. They don't really believe it, but they're expressing their loyalty to Trump or something like this. Now, if a news source just sort of credulously reports exactly that 45% of Republicans believe this, now what's the message that you, a Republican, might take from this? Well, if you're not a Republican, you might think, wow, there's a bunch of crazy people out there. But if you are a Republican, you might think, wow, a lot of people believe this. There must be something to this story, right? So actually, these inflated reports about how many people believe things might actually, ironically, contribute to people believing that very thing. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic. Okay, so what to do about all this stuff? One kind of contentious solution that people have suggested and pursued is content moderation. This can take various forms, kind of flagging misleading or misinformational content, deprioritizing it, removing it, deplatforming the people who spread it. There are all sorts of ethical critiques of this having to do with free expression. I'm going to focus on sort of the epistemology of content moderation, though. So on the face of things, it looks like content moderation looks like a really good resolution to these problems. So insofar as content moderation removes misinformation from the environment, or it makes it less convincing by just sort of flagging that it's false or contested, or deters it, if you deplatform everyone who spreads misinformation, then people will be incentivized not to spread it. That seems to reduce the deceptive threat. So the obvious cases like in the Edgar Madison Welch case, what happened was he saw a YouTube video about Pizzagate, and like 3 days later, he drove to the pizza place and like with a gun and everything. Clearly, if that video had been removed, he wouldn't have done that. That's a good case that sometimes removing misinformation would make a difference when it comes to the deceptive threat. Similarly, insofar as you engage in content moderation that removes or flags misinformation, then whatever's left, people might have increased confidence in it. You can be confident that this is accurate and not misinformation. That mitigates the skeptical threat. And by a similar sort of mechanism, you can safeguard the evidential value of legitimate information. So, for example, if all the misinformation is removed, then forming beliefs based on what you read online would be a relatively reliable belief forming process, and fill in the details for whatever other theory of warrant you like. So, right, these are all sort of good making features of content moderation, but things are a bit more complicated, I think. So one difficulty is that you can't realistically expect to remove all and only misinformation. There's just no way the system is going to be that targeted, right? Some accurate information will accidentally be targeted. Some inaccurate information will be overlooked. One problem with the latter is that there's a sort of known effect that where misinformation is known to be subject to removal or labeling, overlooked misinformation will receive a boost in credibility. This is the implied truth effect. So the idea is basically people have the thought, not really probably explicitly, but implicitly, well, if it were wrong, it wouldn't be here. So the fact that it's here is some reason to think that it's accurate, right? So if you overlook some misinformation and but you're otherwise trying to flag or remove it, then you're going to boost the credibility of that you miss. Another sort of concern is that right, not all platforms will be equally regulated. So if you remove misinformation from some places, well, some people want that what they perceive to be information. So they'll go to other platforms. This has been observed with sort of deplatforming on Reddit or removing subreddits. And the concern then is that, that might be good for some people who just stay on the mainstream platform that's regulated, but then other people will go to these less regulated platforms. They'll receive a super high dose, basically super concentrated dose of misinformation, and they'll be more radicalized than they otherwise would be. I think a more kind of sophisticated concern is that, right, a lot of the things that we know are based on kind of a consensus that like, well, everybody believes this, or maybe all the experts believe this. It's based on a kind of consensus, either expert or more general consensus. One way of accessing consensus would be just to take a sort of informal survey of social media. What are most people saying? The concern, though, is that if you remove misinformation or deplatform misinformers, you can encourage the suspicion that consensus is just sort of manufactured. So this was observed by Yaron Harambam during the COVID pandemic. A lot of kind of conspiracy theory types expressed the concern that, well, it's true that all the doctors on social media say that it's a real pandemic and you should get the vaccine and stuff, but that's because all the real doctors were removed, right? So the real majority actually thinks that the vaccine is dangerous and so on. That's the concern, is that content moderation might create a sort of skeptical threat about, what seems to be the consensus view, right? And that's especially concerning because consensus is really important. It's a way we know about a lot of like things that are outside of our main areas of knowledge. So, right, those kind of skeptical things might seem outlandish, but I don't think that they have to be, right? There's some sense in which it's a reasonable kind of concern, right? So if you have a genuine consensus of epistemic authorities, that's an excellent reason to believe something. And that's because epistemic authorities, they have a kind of threshold of reliability. They're specifically trained in this area of knowledge, blah, 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 blah. They have good information, and so on. But a consensus that is sort of enforced by moderators who are not themselves experts is a much less reliable indicator, right? It's easier for a kind of fake consensus, fake apparent consensus to arise through sort of the operations of moderation, as opposed to sort of organically through the actual operations of experts. So an apparent consensus tainted by moderation is comparatively weak evidence relative to the super strong evidence of a genuine consensus among epistemic authorities. There are some caveats to this last argument. So one thing is that there's, especially in the social media context, it's not as if there's some natural presentation of the evidence that moderation would interfere with. You're always being sort of presented information in a way that's modulated by algorithms that you don't know much about and so on. So it's not as if like only content moderation is like influencing what you see. That's just not the case. Other caveats, so humans are not entirely rational. So for example, people are subject to the truth effect. The more you hear some claim, the more you think it's true. That's not really rational. Like to use Wittgenstein's example, like it would be weird if you read some story in a newspaper and you kind of believed it, and then you picked up a second copy of the same newspaper and you read the same thing. It would be weird to then believe it more based on the second newspaper. That was just an identical copy. But people actually are kind of like that in a sense. That's not rational, but people do it. Similarly, the kind of associations we form, so, you know, the Democrats with corruption and so on, these things are not kind of rationally mediated. People are also motivated reasoners. They'll seek out specific sorts of information that confirm their beliefs, so on. Additionally, there are all sorts of problems with online epistemic environments. There are epistemic bubbles. You know, people have kind of tried to debunk the bubble concept in the sense that there are many like sort of cross-ideological interactions online, but still it's the case that most people receive most or some disproportionate amount of information that confirms their existing beliefs. And similarly, what people see might be sort of manipulated by the operations of trolls, bots, and so on. So here's why it's complicated. Content moderation can be expected to address some of the threats of misinformation, at least sometimes. It can also reduce the impact of the truth effect. You see the false claims less and so on. But it can also cause a problematic implied truth effect. It also threatens to reduce perceived value of consensus. So it does some good things, does some bad things. How is it that we could get the benefits without these harms? This is my suggestion coming to the end here, is instead of sort of systems that are kind of top down, where you have sort of a centralized authority that's determining what you can see, you instead have sort of community-based moderation of content. This already exists in some form on community notes on Twitter, for example. It's incomplete and problematic in some ways, but that's the basic idea. There are a lot of empirical studies on crowdsource accuracy labels for content. It turns out crowds are pretty good at just determining whether content is real or fake. You might have sort of user-driven reliability scores. So based on the results of these crowdsourced accuracy labels, you can assign scores to how reliable different users are. And these might be used to determine how content should be prioritized. So benefits of this approach, again, it's relatively reliable. There are some impressive empirical studies on this. A big benefit, it's also likely to be relatively trusted, right? So if you're a kind of conspiracy-minded type, you might think, well, I don't trust these these content moderators who are working for Twitter and so on. But you might trust like the community a bit more if you're in that sort of epistemic populist position. It also promotes autonomy in a sense of like having people, giving people the opportunity to weigh in on the things that they maybe know about and so on. So it's not just expecting them to totally just believe whatever the authorities say, so on. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Or the hands flew up. So I'm just going to arbitrarily pick. Start with Kevin. We'll get around to you, I'm sure.
thing that you didn't mention is money. And I wonder would this be a relevant factor? So people, for example, people might want to know who pays the salary of the moderators, and they might want transparency in relation to who's funding certain moderators or paying salaries and things like that. That might be relevant as regards trust.
Yeah, so, I mean, my thought is that at least in the collaborative system, you don't need to pay people, right? So like on community notes, people are unpaid, but they still do a pretty good job. I mean, there are questions, there are questions about whether that can be scaled to the amount that you would actually need it to be. But at least in principle, yeah, you could have sort of unpaid crowds doing the moderation. Yeah, does that? Yeah.
Not on? There you go. I was just trying to, I'm just be tired. I was trying to get understand the distinction or the connection between the epistemic threat and the skeptical threat. So the skeptical threat is like you're believing less than you should in some sense, right? The epistemic threat is saying that given this environment, it's harder to get knowledge. But then it would seem then that if you're aware of that,
Yeah.
then you should believe less than, so
Yeah.
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I was trying to understand the connection between the two. If you're like, oh, I see there's this epistemic threat,
Yeah.
therefore I should believe less. But then you were worried about the skeptical threat where you're believing less than you should. You see my?
Well, yeah, so I mean, one way I think you could characterize the skeptical threat is you're believing less than you should in an objective sense, so you're going to be missing out on true beliefs. But you might be doing exactly what you should do in like a subjective or an epistemic sense because you're responding to the actual strength of evidence as it is in your environment, if that makes sense.
But the epistemic threat was supposed to be objective. It was supposed to be like, right? It wasn't supposed to, was the way you were talking about it mostly. I mean, you were leaving it open whether you were an externalist or an internalist, but the way
Yeah.
it was like it is objectively harder to get knowledge. That's what it sounded like the epistemic. Like there's a threat, an actual threat to knowledge, right? No?
Yeah. I think maybe it will turn on like what your views of warrant are, but I mean, so my sense would be like, yeah, to take a simple case, if there are many deepfakes out there, like, and you happen to come across the real video, right? You might sort of be worried, well, there are these other deepfakes, so I'm not gonna, or there are all these other kind of videos, so I'm not gonna believe this thing I see because I'm worried about the threat of deepfakes. I think in that case, you're like objectively doing the wrong thing because the video that you came across is real. So you should, if you want to maximize truth, minimize error, you should believe the content of this video. But nonetheless, it's kind of a reasonable thing to do given the environment that you're in. Yeah, I'm not sure if that.
Well, it's just there's a lot of, we'll talk more, but it's the should here that what you should, that's what we're,
Yeah.
it's getting difficult, right? I mean, if you go back to it's exactly the Faith Barnes case, and it's like, what should you believe?
Yeah.
Right, in some sense you should believe, even if you happen to be lucky to get the one real one in the Faith Barnes world.
Yeah.
But you're saying this other sense of should because you happen, if you're just talking about truth, but that's a, if you're being a good epistemic agent in a way you shouldn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like epistemic agents have like there are multiple norms. Like one is believe truth, but another is believe based on the evidence, and these can come apart in this sort of case. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for the talk. I have lots of thoughts. I just want to give you one, I think, example that might suggest that your solution is problematic.
Sure.
Sorry. So I think you mentioned this in one of your papers as well, this solution. Here's what happened to me. So I follow lots of platforms in search of like misinformation and stuff like that. And I used to go out to 9gag lots of times and I would follow the news sections. And when the war in Ukraine started, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was lots of news there. So I was reading that and I was following the comments. And there was one piece of news that said that Russian media admitted stealing children from Ukraine.
Mhm.
And there was a link to the news article. And as it happens, I read Russian, not because I'm pro-Russian, but because that's how I talk to my wife's family.
Mhm.
You know, that's how I lived in Kazakhstan. So I read the news article, and it actually had nothing to do with it.
Mhm.
So I typically don't post. I'm just like I'm just watching and no touching,
Mhm.
you know. But I posted. I assumed that people want information, so I posted and I said, look. And there was also a picture of some war prisoners in Ukrainian. I also read Ukrainian, so I read all of that and I said, look, this is actually not what's said in the article.
Mhm.
They're talking about children who are orphans, and they're talking about children who are orphans in the Russian-controlled Donbass that was separated in 2014. So they're not talking about this, they're not admitting anything. I'm not saying they're not doing it, I'm just saying that it's not what the article says. I got like shitloads of comments that I'm a Russian pig.
Yeah.
With lots of likes, it was very popular. I was like really shocked. I really didn't mean to, so I never commented after that again. But I think that there's a danger of lots of false positives if you let people moderate in this sense. I think that the problem was that 9gag indeed is full of Russian bots. And I was recognized as a Russian bot because I said something that doesn't go well with the narrative.
Mhm.
Now, I said that it was just a happenstance, you know, it was a chance, it was accidental that I spoke Russian and that I decided to say what's going on.
Mhm.
But I think that your method is problematic in that sense because when you let people who don't know what is going on regulate what's going on,
Yeah.
you end up in a chaos. Now, can I say a bit more about the truth thing? So you say the truth effect.
Mhm.
Your view is based on this Cartesian model of belief formation. You tell me something, I read something, then I think about it, and if it's plausible, I believe it.
Mhm.
There is evidence that this is not how our belief forming mechanisms work. There is evidence that we actually believe everything we see and everything we read.
Mhm.
We first believe it, and then we unbelieve it. We analyze it, and then we unbelieve it. That's why a lie that has been repeated multiple times becomes the truth. It doesn't become true, it becomes believed by people. And that's why propaganda works. And that's why they saturate the digital space with falsehoods. Why is this? Imagine, so we didn't start, our species started like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And imagine you're in the jungle and you hear bushes. And you're a philosopher and you say, well, this could be a lion, this could be a zebra, I could be hearing stuff. When you start analyzing, if it's really a lion, he's gonna eat you.
Mhm.
So people who are contemplating in the jungle didn't get to reproduce because they were eaten by lions. Those who got to reproduce are those who would run away, who would think, oh, it's a lion, and run away right away. So this Spinozian model, it's called Spinozian model. This model is evolutionary, more advantageous, but we're just in a situation in which if I overload you cognitive, you are going to start believing obvious falsehoods. And that's one of the dangers of internet. I apologize for talking so much. Stop me.
That's right.
Stop me.
Yeah, I'll have more to say about the Cartesian Spinozan thing later, but we can talk about that later, I think. But for now, like the other one, yeah, I mean, so like I'm appealing here to like these studies about sort of crowdsourced content moderation, but of course, any crowdsourced thing, like it works if people are reliable above 0.5, basically. Otherwise, they're almost certain to be mistaken. So you need like a background of kind of reliability in order for that to work. So I should say, this is all coming from a book that I wrote before like Twitter went to hell. So it seemed like a good idea at the time. Now I think if you try to crowdsource things, it will not work as well as previously it would. On top of that, I think there are other conditions that you'd want in order for a system like this to work. One of which is not having people post anonymously, having them post under their own names and so on. And then you sort of for one thing, you eliminate like bots and trolls, at least to some extent. And you also eliminate like suspicions about bots and trolls. So people will be more inclined to accept information from others than they are in your case where people are worried about this.
But can you imagine me posting under my real name, even without bots and trolls? I should have been smarter. I should have said to myself, well, this is obviously going against the narrative. So what you're gonna post is really imprudential. Imagine me posting this under my real name. How would that affect me?
On you?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are concerns, I think, like in terms of like the epistemology, what you want is a de-anonymized system, but there are these other like ethical concerns and so on that do arise in that case. Yeah.
Okay, can we talk about the epistemic threat to knowledge, if you think knowledge is safe belief?
Mhm.
So knowledge safe belief says, you know P, only, let's have it be, you know P, if and only if your method that you use for believing P couldn't easily have given you the wrong result. And then the key question for those theorists will be method individuation. And I think one really interesting thing is that I think deep fakes and fake news will actually be quite different. I think deep fakes, some of the people will say that it creates ignorance and some won't. And then for fake news, none of them are going to say it creates ignorance. So here's a fake news case. Imagine I get my news from Wall Street Journal and Breitbart, and I believe either one unreservedly, but I can tell which one is which.
Mhm.
If I can tell which one is which, it's going to be that my method is different in the cases. So then when I use the Wall Street Journal, that method's reliable. So then I'll have knowledge. That's not an epistemic threat. By contrast, with deepfakes, I can't tell. I have the same internal experience, whether I'm looking at a real photograph or a deep. So in the safety literature, people distinguish as two camps on method individuation. There's internalists and externalists. The internalists, like Nozick and Goldman, they think that the method is literally just like your phenomenal internal experiences. So in the deepfake case, you have the same method. So then that's going to be an epistemic threat. But if in the fake news case, you're keeping track of the sources, even if you like both sources, it'll be a different method. It's totally different on the inside because you see the label of the newspapers. So here's a case. But then other people are not internal. So now, okay, so basically, so far then, the upshot would be fake news not an issue, deepfakes is an issue. But is deepfakes an issue? Because not everybody is an internalist about individuation. And here's a case. So Netta in 2004 has this chemical case where you're in the lab, you're in the control group. You drink some orange juice and you look at 7 flashes and you count them and it has 7 flashes. You're in the control group, the orange juice was neutral, you see there's 7 flashes and potentially you know that there were 7. But in the other group, the experimental condition, the orange juice had a chemical in it that makes 7 look like 6. And so in this case, from the inside, you can't tell whether you had orange juice. You'd have the same experience from the inside. But so if you count that as the same method, you wouldn't have knowledge. Netta claims as a counterexample of safety, but Williamson comes back and says, no, the method is different. That's, I think, going to be very structurally similar to deepfake, where when you look at the real photograph, it could be a different method than the fake photograph, even though it's the same from the inside. So that's, I think, what the view is going to be from Safety Line, is that if you have internal methods, then you'll say fake news, not an epistemic threat, deepfakes are. If you have external methods, you'll say neither are an epistemic threat.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so my basic position here is I'm happy to leave it to different theorists to figure out what is going on in these different cases. And I think you will reach totally different verdicts based on what your view, how you fill in warrant. And that you can break that down further into how you fill in what's required for safety and so on. So I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, depending on exactly how you fill these in, there may or may not be a threat here. But at least on some views, there's going to be.
But the one thing is not just the theories, because this chemical case, we're supposed to have an intuition that there's knowledge. So if you have that intuition, that might be kind of intuition pump to get you that there's also knowledge in the deepfake case. In the case where there are deepfakes nearby, but you're looking at a real photograph.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'll have to think about that more. But I mean, my sense is like whatever pressure there is in that direction, there's also going to be kind of pressure coming back because there's a strong intuition there that you don't know in that case, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm glad you picked up the topic of content modulation. I'm local Chinese. I'm more than familiar with this. I just wanted to post something in the morning, and it says preemptive strike, sensitive words detect, not able to post. Okay, and the question is always, for me, for content modulation, is who gets to modulate the content modulators? I don't believe, to my own experiences living in China for 20,000 years, there is no not uninterested modulators. There is always vested motives when it comes to content modulation. It's either political, it's either economic interest, it's not, but definitely some more benevolent scholars or philosophers thinking about the risks of reality or think about the risks of truth and say, oh, I'm going to be the truth keeper. No, everybody is interested to the reality. And for me, the more problematic thing about content modulation is that it gets the wrong question there. It's not about whether we want to check the reality of the information that we receive. When we actually take the term post-truth seriously, what happens is that before this term is created, people have this default attitude when it comes to then reading a piece of information, the implicit feeling about the information is that it is possible to be true. But these days, whenever I encounter or a lot of people coming my generation encounter information, reality is beyond the point. The piece of information may just simply be a topic inducer of what we are going to talk about. So if you read Kierkegaard in the media studies series, he famously said, when you have a face-to-face encounter a news phenomena and you read it in the news, it's a more abstract figure and an abstract story. It's a distancing, and a long time ago, they still have some because people the concerns are this could be real, but this distancing comes into an ultimate stage where people's this is going to be fake at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So what really matters, if the real news, real people get to feel, real people get their experiences from it, but we are talking as if new pieces of information like drama plots, as we were talking in the last episode of 111, what happened? And that's wrong. It usually leads to moral debates. Yeah. And so I think the problem is not for real people, for non-philosophers. The problem is not about the reality or the truthness of the information itself. It's how we actually view information. That is what matters. Because misinformation is not news. Misinformation has always been there. And the way to detect it is a technical issue. But the more urgent issue for me, at least, is the attitude towards information. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, super interesting thoughts there. I mean, in broad strokes, yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. My ambitious hope for this sort of proposal would be that this would, in some sense, restore a default attitude of trust towards the information that you receive. So I think you're exactly right. And there's a lot of interesting work coming out these days, thinking about different sorts of misinformation, more in terms of like narratives than in terms of, actual attempts to get at the truth or something like that. From my perspective, this is really problematic, especially when we turn to, certain types of information like science. You just want it to be the truth, and you want to be able to put credence in it. And I mean, so that the kind of hope is that something like a moderation strategy like this would give people who are otherwise highly skeptical of the information that they receive some grounds for like trusting again, at least in certain sorts of information. That's like the ambitious hope. Who knows if it works or not, but that's the hope. Yeah.
Why don't we, for the last time today, come together in thanking our speakers?
Well,
don't have a lot to say around, other than I think it was really an exciting string of talks and discussions. And again, I'm very happy to see students here. I hope that students enjoy the discussion. This is a very important opportunity for our PhD and master students to really have an experience about what philosophers do. Titus, I loved your statement. For real people, for non-philosophers, before when you were when you were expressing your comments. So I think each of us already still a lot of questions to ask to the speakers or to the talks that we heard today, but we do have the opportunity to discuss more. While we are outside of this venue, we're going to have a reception to have something, little something to eat, little something to drink, and a lot to discuss, so we can continue even outside of this room. I think it's time to go to like ground floor and leave the bunker. We'll be back tomorrow again. Thank you very much to everyone. To our esteemed colleagues from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies that enthusiastically accepted to chair the sessions. We will have a more tomorrow. Today we had